The classified briefing room at Langley fell silent except for the soft hum of encrypted air filtration systems and the barely audible tick of a sweep hand moving across a government-issued wall clock. CIA Director Victoria Cross stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, her steel-gray suit as sharp as her reputation, watching a man who didn't belong in this world of secrets and power. Marcus Chen sat uncomfortably in a metal folding chair that had been hastily brought in from the hallway, the leather executive chairs around the table reserved for people with clearances he'd never held and titles he'd never wanted. His work boots, still carrying traces of playground sand from this morning's drop-off, looked absurdly out of place against the polished marble floor. The faded denim shirt and paint-stained cargo pants marked him as exactly what he appeared to be, a single father who painted houses for a living and had somehow found himself in the most secure building in America. Across the table, Director Cross's daughter Emma fidgeted with nervous energy, her engagement ring catching the overhead lights as she twisted it around her finger. 26 years old, brilliant, and stubborn enough to have insisted on this meeting despite every protocol her mother had spent 30 years upholding. She'd fallen in love with a man her mother had never met, a man whose background check had raised more questions than answers, and she'd refused to accept anything less than her mother's blessing. So, Director Cross said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had silenced hostile foreign ministers and uncooperative senators, Emma tells me you're the man she wants to marry. Her eyes swept over Marcus with the clinical precision of someone trained to read lies in facial expressions and danger in body language. Forgive me if I'm not immediately impressed. Marcus met her gaze steadily, his calloused hands resting calmly on the table. No fidgeting, no defensive posturing, just the quiet presence of a man who'd learned that sometimes the most powerful response was simply being yourself. Ma'am, he said, his voice respectful but not deferential, I understand your concerns. Director Cross circled the table slowly, her heels clicking against marble with military precision. She stopped directly behind Marcus, close enough that most people would have turned to track her movement. He didn't. My daughter is one of the most intelligent people I know, she continued, her voice taking on a theatrical quality that made Emma's stomach tighten with dread. Fluent in 4 languages, advanced degrees in international relations and cryptography, security clearance that took 2 years to obtain. She paused. And she wants to marry a house painter. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Emma started to speak, but her mother raised a hand, a gesture so sharp it could have stopped traffic. I have one question for you, Mr. Chen, Director Cross said, reaching into her briefcase and withdrawing a single sheet of paper covered in what appeared to be random letters and numbers. The document bore classification markings that Marcus couldn't read but somehow recognized as serious. This is a coded message intercepted from a hostile intelligence service. My best cryptographers have been working on it for 6 weeks. She placed the paper in front of him with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the silence. Decode it. You have 60 seconds. Emma's face went pale. Mother, this is... Quiet. Director Cross's voice cut through the room like a blade. Her eyes never left Marcus. 60 seconds, Mr. Chen. Show me what kind of man my daughter is choosing over the Princeton graduate and the State Department rising star I've introduced her to. Marcus stared down at the paper. The symbols seemed to swim before his eyes, not because he couldn't read them, but because he suddenly understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about Emma's choice in men. This was about a secret he'd buried so deep that even he sometimes forgot it existed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Director Cross checked her watch with theatrical precision. 30 seconds, Mr. Chen. Marcus picked up the pen she'd left on the table, his movement deliberate and controlled. As he began to write, his handwriting shifted from the casual scrawl of a working man to the precise, economical script of someone trained in operational security. The letters flowed across the paper beneath the coded message, each symbol translating with the fluency of muscle memory that never truly fades. Time, Director Cross announced. Marcus set down the pen and slid the paper back across the table without a word. Director Cross picked it up, her expression confident and dismissive, until her eyes focused on what he'd written. The blood drained from her face. The paper trembled almost imperceptibly in her hands. When she spoke, her voice carried a note that Emma had never heard before, uncertainty. "Where did you learn this?" she whispered. Marcus looked at Emma, then back at her mother. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years he'd never discussed and choices he'd never explained. "Some things you never forget, even when you try to." Director Cross sank into the nearest chair, the paper still clutched in her hand. In the silence that followed, the air conditioning seemed impossibly loud, and the ticking of the wall clock marked time in a room where the balance of power had just shifted in ways none of them had anticipated. Because the message Marcus had decoded didn't just prove he understood enemy cryptography. The operational details buried in those symbols revealed something far more unsettling. This wasn't an intercepted enemy communication at all. It was an internal CIA training exercise, classified at levels that required presidential authorization to access. And Marcus Chen, house painter and single father, had just solved it in 43 seconds. Emma's voice cut through the suffocating silence, high and strained. "Mother, what's happening? What did he write?" Director Cross couldn't seem to find her voice. She stared at the decoded message as if it contained her own death warrant. Finally, she looked up at Marcus, and for the first time in Emma's memory, her mother, the woman who had stared down foreign dictators and hostile senators, looked genuinely shaken. "This exercise," she said slowly, "was classified under Presidential Daily Brief protocols. Code name Operation Mirrorglass. Only 14 people in the entire intelligence community have access to these materials." Her eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" Marcus glanced at Emma, who was looking between her mother and the man she loved with growing confusion and fear. He'd spent 8 years building a life where this conversation would never happen. 8 years of parent-teacher conferences and little league games and birthday parties where nobody asked about his past. 8 years of being just Marcus, Emma's boyfriend, Sophie's dad, the guy who showed up on time and did good work and kept his secrets buried so deep they'd become archaeological layers. "I'm exactly who I told you I was," he said quietly. "I paint houses. I coach my daughter's soccer team. I make pancakes on Saturday mornings." He paused. "I just used to do other things." Director Cross set the paper down with deliberate care, as if it might explode. "Used to do other things," she repeated. "Mr. Chen, the cryptographic methodology you just employed hasn't been used operationally since," she stopped, calculating. "Since 2016. The Kazakhstan operation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A hardening, subtle as winter frost forming on glass. "I wouldn't know anything about that. Wouldn't you?" Director Cross leaned forward. "Because the after-action reports from that mission described an intelligence analyst attached to a Special Activities Division team. Someone with an unprecedented ability to break enemy codes in real time during active operations." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Someone who disappeared from official records after the mission went sideways and 3 operators didn't come home." Emma felt the world tilting beneath her. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" Marcus looked at the woman he loved, this brilliant, beautiful person who knew him as the man who brought her coffee in bed and helped her with crossword puzzles and had never, not once, mentioned that he'd spent 6 years moving through the dark spaces between countries where diplomatic immunity didn't exist and mistakes were measured in body counts. "I was a different person then," he said simply. Director Cross laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A different person. Is that what we're calling it?" She stood and began pacing again, but this time her movements were agitated, predatory. "Let me tell you what I know about your different person, Mr. Chen. I know that Station Chief Reeves submitted a commendation for an unnamed analyst who cracked a Russian Federation cipher that had stumped NSA's best people for 8 months. I know that same analyst provided real-time intelligence support during a hostage extraction in Almaty that saved the lives of 2 American diplomats." She stopped pacing and fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel. "And I know that when the exfiltration went wrong and the team was compromised, that analysts stayed behind to destroy classified materials rather than compromise ongoing operations. 3 men died because someone in our chain of command leaked operational details to hostile actors. The analyst was declared Kia when satellite surveillance showed the safe house burning. Emma's hand went to her throat. Killed in action? Except, Director Cross continued, no body was ever recovered. And now, 8 years later, I find a house painter who can decode classified communications faster than career intelligence officers, sitting in my conference room asking for permission to marry my daughter. The silence stretched like a held breath. Marcus stared at his hands, these scarred, paint-stained hands that had once transmitted coordinates for drone strikes and broken codes that saved American lives and held pressure against bullet wounds in the back seat of vehicles racing through hostile territory. The men who died, he said finally, his voice so quiet they had to strain to hear him. They had families. Yes, Director Cross replied. They did. Their families think they died because of bad intelligence. Poor operational security. Marcus looked up, and Emma saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, a grief so deep it seemed to have its own gravity. That's not what happened. Director Cross sat back down, her demeanor shifting from interrogation to something closer to recognition. No. It's not. Emma felt like she was drowning in information she couldn't process. Someone explain to me what's happening. Right now. Marcus reached for her hand. She let him take it, but her fingers remained stiff, uncertain. The Kazakhstan operation was supposed to be a simple intelligence-gathering mission. Get in, photograph documents, get out. But when we arrived, the situation was wrong. There were hostages, 2 American diplomats who'd been taken during a supposed cultural exchange that was actually an FSB trap. His thumb traced across Emma's knuckles, a gesture he'd made 1,000 times. But now it felt like he was anchoring himself to something real in a room full of ghosts. The team leader made the call to extract the hostages. Protocol said to abort, call for backup, wait for official authorization. But those diplomats would have been dead by morning, and we all knew it. Marcus's voice remained steady, but Emma could feel the slight tremor in his hands. So we went in. Director Cross leaned forward, her professional interest overriding her personal suspicions. The after-action reports were classified above my clearance level. What really happened in that compound? Someone knew we were coming, Marcus said simply. The exfiltration point was compromised. The backup routes were blocked. Everything we'd planned, everything we'd prepared for, they were ready for all of it. He looked directly at Director Cross. Which meant someone with access to our operational details had fed them to the wrong people. Emma's engineering mind began processing the implications. You're saying there was a leak. Someone on the American side was working with the Russians. I'm saying 3 good men died because someone prioritized politics over operational security. Marcus's voice carried a weight that made Emma understand, for the first time, why he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night staring at the ceiling. The team leader, Rodriguez, took 2 rounds to the chest covering our withdrawal. Communications specialist named Patterson bled out in the stairwell because we couldn't get to him in time. And the sniper, Thompson, stayed behind to buy us time to reach the secondary extraction point. Director Cross's expression had shifted entirely. The theatrical antagonism was gone, replaced by the focused attention of a professional recognizing another professional's pain. You stayed with the classified materials. Someone had to. Marcus shrugged as if it had been the most obvious choice in the world. If those documents had been captured, they would have compromised every asset we had in Eastern Europe. 20 years of intelligence networks, burned. Hundreds of people who'd risked their lives to help us, dead. So you destroyed everything and let them assume you died in the fire. Marcus nodded. It seemed like the cleanest solution. Emma pulled her hand free, not in anger but in shock. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the Virginia landscape without really seeing it. Behind her, she could hear her mother and the man she'd planned to marry discussing operational details and classified failures with the casual familiarity of old colleagues. 8 years, she said without turning around. 8 years we've been together. 8 years of conversations about your day, about your past, about everything. Her voice cracked slightly. And you never mentioned that you used to be a spy? I was never a spy, Marcus said gently. I was an analyst. I broke codes and processed intelligence and provided support for people who did the dangerous work. Emma turned around, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You let people think you were dead, Marcus. You had a memorial service. Your name is probably on a wall somewhere. Director Cross cleared her throat. Actually, his name isn't on the wall. When an operative is declared Kia but no body is recovered, and when there are questions about the circumstances of the mission, the memorial process is delayed, pending further investigation. Which never came, Marcus added. Because officially, I never existed. The Kazakhstan operation was conducted under non-official cover. No diplomatic immunity, no government acknowledgement if things went wrong. He looked at Emma with an expression that begged for understanding. When I walked away, I became a civilian. Completely. No contact with the agency, no ongoing obligations, no safety net if my cover was blown. And no way to clear the names of the men who died, Director Cross said quietly. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus's jaw tightened, the first sign of real anger Emma had seen from him since this surreal conversation began. I tried, he said. I spent 6 months after Kazakhstan trying to get someone in the intelligence community to investigate the leak. I had evidence, communications patterns, financial records that showed. He stopped, shook his head. It didn't matter. The official narrative was cleaner. Operational failure due to insufficient preparation and poor tactical judgment. Case closed. Director Cross studied his face with new intensity. What evidence? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his wallet and pulled out what looked like a normal credit card. Except when he slid it across the table toward Director Cross, she could see the edge of a micro SD card embedded in the plastic. Everything I could collect before I had to run, he said. Communications logs, financial transfers, travel records. 8 years of wondering if any of it would ever matter. Emma stared at the innocuous piece of plastic. You've been carrying that around this whole time? Insurance, Marcus said simply. In case they ever found me and I needed to prove I wasn't the leak. Director Cross picked up the card with hands that weren't quite steady. She'd spent her entire career in a world where information was the ultimate currency, and she was holding what might be the key to a mystery that had haunted the intelligence community for nearly a decade. If this contains what you say it does, she said slowly, there are people who would kill to keep it buried. Yes, Marcus agreed. Which is why I disappeared. And why I've spent 8 years painting houses and coaching soccer and trying very hard not to be the person who collected that information. Emma sat back down, her mind reeling. The man she'd fallen in love with, the man who made her laugh and brought her soup when she was sick and knew exactly how she liked her coffee, was the same person who'd walked into hostile territory and made life-or-death decisions and carried classified secrets that could apparently still get people killed. Sophie, she said suddenly. Your daughter. Does she know? Marcus shook his head. She knows her mother died when she was 2. Cancer, which is true. She knows I used to have a different job that required a lot of travel, which is also true. She doesn't know anything else. And you plan to marry me without ever telling me any of this? The question hung between them like a chasm. Marcus looked at Emma with an expression that contained 8 years of careful compartmentalization and the sudden, terrifying vulnerability of a man whose carefully constructed walls had just crumbled. I plan to love you, he said simply. The same way I've loved you for 3 years. The same way I plan to love you tomorrow, and next week, and when we're both gray and arguing about whose turn it is to take out the garbage. He paused. I thought that part mattered more than the part that was over. Director Cross cleared her throat, and both of them turned toward her as if they'd forgotten she was in the room. She was holding the card up to the light, examining the micro SD edge with professional curiosity. Mr. Chen, she said without looking at him, how long would it take you to decrypt the current generation of Russian diplomatic codes? The question seemed to come from nowhere. Emma frowned, confused by the apparent non sequitur. But Marcus understood immediately. Depends on the complexity and whether they've updated their base algorithm since I was active, he answered. Anywhere from 6 hours to 6 weeks. And Chinese military communications? Similar time frame, but I'd need access to current traffic patterns to establish baseline encryption methods. Director Cross finally looked up from the card. I have a proposition for both of you. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Mother, what are you thinking? I'm thinking, Director Cross said slowly, that it's possible for Mr. Chen to honor both his past and his present. The intelligence on this card could clear the names of 3 dead operators and expose a leak that's been compromising American interests for 8 years. But we'd need someone who understands the material well enough to present it properly. She looked directly at Marcus. Someone who was there. Someone who knows what really happened. Marcus was already shaking his head. I have a daughter to think about. A life I've built. I can't go back to that world. I'm not asking you to go back, Director Cross replied. I'm asking you to finish what you started. Consulting work, limited engagement, full protection for you and your family. She paused. An official recognition for Rodriguez, Patterson, and Thompson. The room fell silent again. Outside, a helicopter passed overhead, its rotors beating a rhythm that seemed to mark time in a space where past and present were colliding with devastating force. Emma looked between her mother and Marcus, these 2 people she loved who were suddenly speaking a language she didn't fully understand. Intelligence work, operational security, classified materials, it all felt like something from a movie, not something that belonged in her real life. But as she watched Marcus struggle with the decision, she saw something else. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked like a man carrying a weight that might finally have a chance of being lifted. The families, she said quietly. Rodriguez, Patterson, Thompson. They still don't know the truth about how their loved ones died. Marcus's hands tightened into fists. No. They don't. Emma reached across the table and touched his arm. Then maybe it's time they did. Director Cross leaned back in her chair, watching this exchange with the calculating expression of someone who'd spent her career reading people and situations. She could see the moment Marcus made his decision, could see it in the way his shoulders straightened and his breathing changed. Limited engagement, he said finally. Full protection for Emma and Sophie. And when it's finished, it's finished. No ongoing obligations, no future recruitment attempts. Agreed, Director Cross replied. On one condition. Emma and Marcus both looked at her warily. You marry my daughter first, she said with the faintest hint of a smile. Because if you're going to be consulting for the CIA, I want to make sure you're properly motivated to come home in one piece. Emma stared at her mother in shock. Are you giving us your blessing? Director Cross looked at Marcus with an expression that was part respect, part challenge, and part something that might have been motherly approval. I'm saying that any man who can decode classified communications in 43 seconds and still remember to put the toilet seat down is probably worth keeping around. For the first time since this conversation began, Marcus smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression he'd been wearing, but a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look like the man Emma had fallen in love with. So, he said, I guess I should probably mention that I still have contacts in 3 different intelligence services and a bank account in Switzerland that your background check probably didn't find. Director Cross laughed, a sound Emma hadn't heard from her mother in years. Mr. Chen, I think you and I are going to get along just fine. Outside the conference room, the CIA continued its daily operations, analysts processing intelligence, officers managing assets, the massive machinery of American intelligence grinding through its eternal mission of keeping the country safe. But inside this small space, something much simpler and more profound had just occurred. A family had been formed, not through blood or marriage, but through the recognition of shared purpose and mutual respect. And a man who'd been carrying the weight of 3 dead colleagues and 8 years of enforced silence had just been offered the chance to set down his burden and pick up something better, a future where his past wasn't a secret to be hidden, but a strength to be honored. The truth would come out. The families would learn how their loved ones had really died. The leak would be exposed and stopped. And Marcus Chen, house painter and former intelligence analyst, would finally be able to stop looking over his shoulder and start looking ahead. But first, apparently, he had a wedding to plan. 3 weeks later, Marcus Chen stood in the basement of a CIA safe house in McLean, Virginia, staring at a wall covered in photographs, documents, and red string connecting points of evidence like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. The space had been hastily converted from a storage room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across folding tables loaded with classified files and computer equipment that probably cost more than most people's houses. Sophie Chen, now 9 years old and blissfully unaware that her father was consulting for the same government agency she'd seen in spy movies, sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor of Emma's apartment 20 minutes away, working on a social studies project about American heroes. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. "Dad's helping some people at work figure out a really complicated puzzle," Emma had explained when Sophie asked why Marcus was spending so much time in meetings. "Like when you help me with crosswords, but bigger." Sophie had accepted this explanation with the easy adaptability of children, especially since it meant more time with Emma, who let her eat ice cream for breakfast and taught her card tricks that would probably get her in trouble at school. Director Cross entered the basement carrying 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who'd been reviewing intelligence reports since before dawn. She'd traded her usual sharp business attire for dark slacks and a sweater, still professional, but acknowledging that this wasn't a normal CIA operation. "The patterns are starting to emerge," she said, setting one of the cups near Marcus without ceremony. Over the past 3 weeks, their relationship had shifted from mutual suspicion to something resembling collegial respect. Financial transactions, communication intercepts, travel logs. It's all there, but it's buried under 8 years of careful misdirection. Marcus pulled up a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. The furniture in CIA safe houses wasn't selected for comfort. "The problem isn't finding the evidence," he replied, pointing to a cluster of documents highlighted in yellow. "The problem is that the evidence points to someone who spent the last 8 years becoming untouchable." On the wall, a photograph showed Deputy Director James Harrington at a congressional hearing, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression conveying the kind of confident authority that came from decades of successful bureaucratic maneuvering. Below his picture, a timeline tracked his career advancement, each promotion coinciding suspiciously with the successful conclusion of operations that had relied on intelligence Marcus had provided. "Harrington wasn't just a leak," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd spent weeks connecting dots that painted an ugly picture. "He was actively selling operational details to Russian intelligence. The Kazakhstan mission wasn't compromised by accident. It was betrayed." Director Cross sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of her 52 years. "James has been my deputy for 4 years. He's been to my house for dinner. Emma calls him Uncle Jim." She rubbed her temples. "How did I miss this?" "Because he's good at his job," Marcus replied without judgment. "And because the best way to hide treason is to wrap it in patriotism and bureaucratic efficiency. The evidence was damning once you knew how to read it." Swiss bank accounts opened 3 days after the Kazakhstan mission briefing. Encrypted communications with known FSB operatives that followed the same timing patterns as CIA operational planning meetings. Travel records that showed Harrington in Prague and Vienna and half a dozen other cities where intelligence was routinely bought and sold, always with plausible official cover. "The families," Director Cross said quietly. "Rodriguez left behind a wife and 2 daughters. Patterson's parents are still alive, they're in their 70s, and they've spent 8 years believing their son died because of poor leadership and tactical mistakes." Marcus nodded. He'd been thinking about the families constantly, imagining conversations where he'd have to explain that their loved ones had died not because of professional failure, but because someone they trusted had sold them to the enemy for money. "Thompson's widow remarried," he added. "She's got a new family now, kids who call another man dad. Opening this up means destroying the peace she's found." They sat in uncomfortable silence, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and faced with the knowledge that justice would require inflicting fresh pain on people who'd already suffered enough. Director Cross's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her in weeks. "Emma," she explained. She's sending pictures of Sophie's social studies presentation. Apparently, she chose to research Harriet Tubman. Good choice, Marcus replied. Someone who understood that sometimes you have to operate in secret to save lives. The comment hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Director Cross looked at him with new understanding. You're not just doing this for Rodriguez and the others, she said. You're doing this so you can stop being a secret from Sophie. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the evidence wall and stared at the photograph of Harrington, this man who'd smiled at him during mission briefings while simultaneously planning his death. I've spent 8 years lying to my daughter about who I am, he said finally. Not directly, but by omission. Every time she asks about my old job, every time she wonders why I don't have any friends from before she was born, every time she sees me wake up from nightmares I can't explain. He turned back to Director Cross. She deserves to know that her father isn't a coward who ran away from his problems. She deserves to know he's someone who stood up for what was right. Even if it means putting you both in danger. Marcus pointed to the security cameras mounted in the corners of the basement, the armed guards stationed outside, the comprehensive protection detail that had been shadowing Sophie and Emma for 3 weeks. We're already in danger. We have been since the moment I decoded that message in your conference room. Harrington knows I'm alive now. Your security briefings would have mentioned my involvement. The only way to make Sophie safe is to finish this. Director Cross's phone rang. She answered it with professional efficiency, but Marcus could see her expression change as she listened to whoever was on the other end. When? She asked. How long do we have? Marcus felt his stomach drop. In the intelligence world, urgent phone calls rarely brought good news. Director Cross ended the call and immediately began shutting down the computer equipment. Harrington just requested an emergency briefing on our investigation. He's claiming he has new intelligence about the Kazakhstan leak. She looked at Marcus with grim determination. He's making his move. Which means he's either planning to discredit our evidence before we can present it, or he's planning to eliminate the people who collected it. She handed Marcus a secure phone and a set of car keys. Get to Emma's apartment. Now. Bring them both to the secondary safe house. Marcus was already moving toward the door. What about the evidence? I'll handle the evidence. You handle what matters more. 25 minutes later, Marcus was climbing the stairs to Emma's second-floor apartment, taking them 3 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs. The hallway was quiet, too quiet for a building that usually buzzed with the sounds of families and televisions and normal life. He reached Emma's door and knocked in the pattern they'd agreed upon, 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. No answer. Marcus tried the handle. Locked, but the deadbolt wasn't engaged. Emma never forgot to engage the deadbolt. He pulled out the lock-picking tools Director Cross had insisted he carry and had the door open in 30 seconds. The apartment was dark, curtains drawn, silence pressing against his ears like water. Emma, he called softly. Sophie? A muffled sound came from the bedroom. Marcus moved toward it, every instinct screaming danger, his hand automatically reaching for the service weapon he hadn't carried in 8 years. He found them in the bedroom closet, bound with zip ties, mouths covered with duct tape, but alive and alert. Emma's eyes were wide with fear and fury. Sophie looked confused and scared, but when she saw Marcus, her expression shifted to relief. Marcus cut them free with a knife he'd started carrying out of old habit. Emma immediately pulled Sophie into her arms while Marcus checked the apartment for signs of how long ago their captors had left. How many? He asked Emma as he helped her to her feet. 3 men, she whispered, her voice hoarse from the tape. They knew about our security detail. They knew exactly when the guards changed shifts. They knew, she stopped, understanding hitting her like a physical blow. They knew because Harrington told them. Marcus nodded grimly. He's not just covering his tracks anymore. He's eliminating witnesses. Sophie looked between the 2 adults, her 9-year-old mind trying to process a situation that belonged in action movies, not in her real life. Dad, what's happening? Why did those men tie us up? Why are you carrying a knife? Marcus knelt down to Sophie's eye level, the same way he'd done 1,000 times for scraped knees and bad dreams and homework frustrations. But this time, he was about to have the conversation he'd hoped to avoid for at least a few more years. Sophie, he said gently, remember how I told you that I used to have a different job before you were born? A job that required a lot of traveling? She nodded solemnly. That job was helping the government solve very complicated puzzles to keep people safe. And sometimes, when you solve those puzzles, you learn things that bad people don't want you to know. He touched her cheek softly. Those men who were here, they work for someone who doesn't want me to tell other people about a puzzle I solved a long time ago. Sophie's eyes widened, but not with fear, with understanding that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Like when Tommy Morrison's dad couldn't talk about his job in the army? Exactly like that, Marcus replied. Except my puzzle is finished now, and it's time for the right people to know the answer. Emma watched this exchange with growing amazement. Here was Marcus, explaining state secrets and personal danger to a 9-year-old in language that made perfect sense while simultaneously planning their escape from people who wanted them dead. The man she'd fallen in love with and the intelligence operative he used to be weren't different people, they were the same person, using different tools for the same fundamental purpose, protecting the people he loved. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Director Cross, Safe House compromised. Use backup protocol 7. We need to move, he told Emma. Now. Emma grabbed Sophie's backpack and stuffed it with essential items, medications, a change of clothes, the stuffed elephant Sophie had slept with since she was 3. Marcus disabled the apartment's security system and checked the hallway before leading them toward the fire escape. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. As they climbed down the fire escape into the alley behind the building, Sophie suddenly stopped. Dad, wait. Marcus turned back, expecting questions or fear or the kind of breakdown that would be entirely reasonable for a child in this situation. Instead, Sophie looked at him with an expression of fierce determination. The bad people, she said. They hurt Uncle Rodriguez and Uncle Patterson and Uncle Thompson, didn't they? That's what the puzzle was about. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Yes, sweetheart. That's what the puzzle was about. Sophie nodded once, decisively. Then we solve it. For them. Emma took Marcus's hand as they reached the ground level. She's right. We solve it. Marcus looked at these two people who'd somehow become his entire world, this brilliant woman who'd chosen to love him despite learning that half his life had been classified, and this incredible child who understood justice and loyalty better than most adults. Together, he said. They made their way through the back streets of Alexandria, avoiding main roads, using the kind of tradecraft Marcus had hoped never to need again. But as they walked, something felt different from the old days. In Kazakhstan, he'd been running from death with nothing to lose except classified information and his own life. Now he was running toward something, toward a future where Sophie could know who her father really was, where Emma could understand the man she'd fallen in love with, where 3 dead operators could finally receive the honor they'd earned. The backup safe house was a small apartment above a used bookstore in Georgetown, the kind of place that looked completely unremarkable from the outside while containing enough surveillance equipment and defensive measures to protect a small country's worth of state secrets. Director Cross was waiting for them, along with a woman Marcus didn't recognize, tall, athletic, with the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to violence. Marcus Chen, Director Cross said by way of introduction, meet Agent Sarah Martinez, formerly of Special Activities Division. She was Rodriguez's partner on 3 different operations. Agent Martinez stepped forward and offered her hand. Carlos talked about you, she said simply. He said you were the smartest person he'd ever worked with, and that if anything ever happened to him, you'd be the one to figure out why. Marcus shook her hand, feeling the weight of expectation and grief and hope all bundled together in that brief contact. We're going to figure it out, he promised. Director Cross led them to a computer terminal where new intelligence was still arriving in real time. Harrington made a mistake, she explained. He tried to access our investigation files remotely, thinking he could monitor our progress without drawing attention. But our IT security flagged the intrusion, and we traced it back to his personal device. On the screen, a series of communications showed Harrington coordinating with known FSB operatives, planning what appeared to be a comprehensive elimination of everyone connected to the Kazakhstan evidence. Marcus's name was at the top of the target list, followed by Director Cross, Agent Martinez, and several others. "He's not just covering up the past anymore," Agent Martinez observed. "He's trying to prevent any future investigations." Sophie, who had been quietly observing from a corner where Emma had set up a makeshift study area, suddenly looked up from the book she was pretending to read. "Why doesn't he just say he's sorry?" The room fell silent. For intelligence professionals, combined decades of experience in the dark arts of espionage and counterterrorism, stopped by a 9-year-old's question. Marcus walked over to his daughter. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well," Sophie said with the devastating logic of childhood, "if he did something wrong, and he's sorry about it, why doesn't he just say so and try to fix it? Instead of hurting more people?" Emma smiled sadly. "Because some people would rather hurt others than admit they made a mistake." "That's stupid," Sophie declared. "Yes," Agent Martinez agreed. "It really is." Director Cross checked her watch. "Harrington's called an emergency directors meeting for tomorrow morning. He's planning to present evidence that our investigation is compromised, probably by suggesting that Marcus is actually a Russian asset who's been feeding us disinformation." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "He's going to flip the script. Make me the traitor instead of him." "Exactly. Which means we have about 18 hours to present our evidence to people who can act on it before he discredits everything we've collected." Agent Martinez pulled out her own phone and began making calls. "I can reach Patterson's parents and Thompson's widow. They deserve to know what we found before this becomes a media circus." Director Cross nodded. "I'll contact Rodriguez's family. And I'll arrange for a secure briefing with the Inspector General's office first thing in the morning." Marcus looked around the room at these people who'd become his allies, his extended family, his team. 8 years ago, he'd walked away from the intelligence world believing he'd never trust another government operation again. Now he was surrounded by professionals risking their careers to honor 3 dead men and protect a house painter's daughter. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. "If Harrington is desperate enough to try assassinating American intelligence officers on domestic soil, he's desperate enough to run. We need to make sure he doesn't disappear before we can present the evidence." Director Cross smiled grimly. "Already handled. As of 1 hour ago, Deputy Director Harrington is under discreet surveillance by a joint FBI-CIA task force. Official cover is a routine security review." Emma looked up from the tablet where she'd been helping Sophie with homework. "What happens after tomorrow?" Marcus considered the question. In 18 hours, either James Harrington would be exposed as a traitor and 3 dead operators would be posthumously honored, or Marcus Chen would be branded a Russian asset and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. "After tomorrow," he said, reaching for Emma's hand, "we plan a wedding." Sophie clapped her hands together. "Can I be the flower girl?" "You can be whatever you want to be," Marcus replied, and for the first time in 8 years, he meant it without reservation. Outside, Washington, D.C. settled into evening, the city's monuments glowing against the dark sky like promises of justice and truth. Inside the safe house, a family prepared for the most important day of their lives, knowing that tomorrow would either vindicate years of pain and silence or destroy everything they'd built together. But tonight, for the first time since Kazakhstan, Marcus Chen fell asleep without checking the locks, without mapping escape routes, without wondering if he'd live to see morning. Because tonight, he wasn't sleeping alone with his secrets. Tonight, he was surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was and had chosen to stand with him anyway. The morning of reckoning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of Washington drizzle that seemed to seep through even the most carefully constructed defenses. Marcus stood in the lobby of CIA headquarters at Langley, wearing a suit Emma had helped him select, navy blue, conservative, the kind of outfit that conveyed respectability without drawing attention. In his briefcase, he carried 8 years of carefully preserved evidence and the hope that truth would prove stronger than politics. Sophie had hugged him extra tight that morning, her small arms wrapped around his neck as she whispered, "Solve the puzzle, Dad. For Uncle Carlos and Uncle Patterson and Uncle Thompson." She didn't fully understand the complexities of what was about to happen, but she understood that her father was finally going to tell the truth about something that had been hurting him for a long time. Director Cross emerged from the security checkpoint, her expression grim but determined. "Harrington arrived an hour ago," she reported quietly. "He's been in meetings with the Director of National Intelligence and the Deputy Attorney General. Whatever he's planning, he's moving fast." Agent Martinez joined them, carrying a tablet loaded with testimony from the families of the 3 dead operators. "Rodriguez's widow wants to address the panel personally," she said. "Patterson's parents are too elderly to travel, but they've provided written statements. Thompson's current family." She paused. "Thompson's current family asked not to be involved. They want to let the past stay buried." Marcus nodded, understanding the complexity of grief and the different ways people chose to honor or protect themselves from painful memories. 3 families, 3 different responses to the same tragedy. That's human. "The Inspector General's office has agreed to hear our presentation," Director Cross continued, "but they've also agreed to hear Harrington's counter-evidence. We're essentially on trial, and he's the prosecutor." As they walked toward the conference room where Marcus's life would be decided, he found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a house painter whose biggest concern was whether Sophie's soccer team would make the playoffs. Now he was about to accuse a high-ranking government official of treason while simultaneously proving that he wasn't the traitor himself. The conference room was larger than the one where this had all begun, with windows overlooking the Virginia countryside and a long table surrounded by chairs occupied by some of the most powerful people in the American intelligence community. At the head sat Inspector General Patricia Valdez, a woman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for political games. Deputy Director James Harrington sat 3 chairs down from the Inspector General, looking every inch the distinguished public servant, silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit impeccably tailored, the kind of presence that conveyed decades of loyal service to his country. When he saw Marcus enter, his expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, calculation, and perhaps a hint of fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector General Valdez began, "we're here to resolve conflicting accounts of events surrounding Operation Kazakhstan, which took place 8 years ago and resulted in the deaths of 3 American intelligence operatives. We will hear presentations from both parties and review all available evidence before making our determination." She gestured toward Marcus. "Mr. Chen, you may begin." Marcus stood, feeling the weight of 8 years of silence about to be lifted. He began with the facts, the original mission parameters, the discovery of hostages, the decision to extract them despite orders to abort. He walked the panel through the ambush, the deaths of his teammates, and his own escape with classified materials. "The official report blamed the team for tactical failures," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. "But the evidence I collected tells a different story. Someone in our command structure was feeding operational details to Russian intelligence. Someone who knew our routes, our timing, our protocols." He opened his briefcase and began distributing copies of financial records, communication intercepts, and travel logs. Deputy Director Harrington received payments totaling $4.7 million from accounts connected to Russian intelligence services. These payments coincided directly with missions I supported, missions where sensitive information was later found to have been compromised. A murmur ran through the room. Several panel members leaned forward, studying the documents with growing interest. Harrington remained calm, even allowing himself a slight smile. "Inspector General Valdez," he said smoothly, "what we're seeing here is a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to deflect attention from the real traitor in this room." He stood and activated a presentation screen that displayed what appeared to be financial records of Marcus's own. "Thomas Chen, if that's even his real name, has been in contact with Russian intelligence services since before the Kazakhstan operation. The evidence he's presenting today was provided to him by his handlers to use in exactly this kind of operation." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. The financial records looked authentic, showing payments from Russian accounts to banks in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. If you didn't know they were fabricated, they would be utterly convincing. Furthermore, Harrington continued, Mr. Chen disappeared immediately after Kazakhstan not because he was protecting classified materials, but because his cover was blown. He spent 8 years living under a false identity, waiting for an opportunity to complete his mission of destroying American intelligence operations from within. Director Cross started to speak, but Harrington wasn't finished. The greatest tragedy here isn't just that Rodriguez, Patterson, and Thompson died because of leaked intelligence. It's that their deaths were caused by a man they trusted, a man who's now sitting in this room trying to frame me for his own crimes. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus could see doubt creeping into the faces of panel members who had seemed convinced by his evidence moments before. Harrington's presentation was masterful, just enough truth mixed with lies to create a compelling alternative narrative. Inspector General Valdez looked between Marcus and Harrington. Mr. Chen, how do you respond to these allegations? Marcus stood slowly, his mind racing. Everything Harrington had just presented was false, but proving it would require resources and time they didn't have. He could feel the moment slipping away, could see his chance for justice dissolving into bureaucratic uncertainty. Then he remembered Sophie's question from the night before, why doesn't he just say he's sorry? Marcus walked to the presentation screen and turned to face the panel. Inspector General, I'm going to tell you something that Deputy Director Harrington doesn't know I know. The room tensed with anticipation. 3 days ago, Harrington sent a team to kidnap my fiancée and my 9-year-old daughter, Marcus said quietly. They were held at gunpoint while Harrington attempted to eliminate the evidence we're presenting today. My family was threatened not because I'm a Russian asset, but because I'm about to expose one. Harrington's face remained impassive, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around his eyes. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Chen. Do you have any proof? Marcus smiled. As a matter of fact, I do. He pulled out his phone and played an audio recording. Agent Martinez's voice came through clearly, Mr. Harrington, this is Agent Martinez with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit treason, attempted murder of federal witnesses, and violation of the Espionage Act. The recording continued with the sound of handcuffs clicking and Harrington's voice, shaky now, saying, you don't understand. I had to protect myself. Chen was going to destroy everything. Marcus turned off the recording and looked directly at Harrington. You were arrested 2 hours ago as you attempted to board a private flight to a non-extradition country. The Swiss bank accounts you showed this panel? They belong to you, not me. We simply replaced my name with yours in the documents. The room erupted. Harrington shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking. This is entrapment. You can't use illegally obtained recordings. Inspector General Valdez raised her hand for silence. Mr. Harrington, you are no longer a participant in this proceeding. Please remain seated while we contact security. As 2 security officers escorted a shaken Harrington from the room, Marcus felt a weight he'd carried for 8 years finally begin to lift. But the most important part was still to come. Inspector General, he said quietly, I have one final piece of evidence. He opened his briefcase and withdrew 3 folders, each one marked with the name of a fallen operator. These contain the complete operational records of Rodriguez, Patterson, and Thompson. Not the sanitized versions that went into the official files, but the real records that show 3 men who died because they chose to save American lives rather than follow orders that would have let innocent people die. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. They weren't reckless. They weren't undisciplined. They were heroes who made the right call in an impossible situation, and they died because someone they trusted sold them to the enemy. He placed the folders on the table in front of Inspector General Valdez. Carlos Rodriguez left behind a wife and 2 daughters who've spent 8 years believing their husband and father died because of poor leadership. David Patterson's parents are in their 70s, and they've carried the shame of thinking their son failed in his duty. Michael Thompson's family has tried to move on, but they've never had closure because they never knew the truth. Marcus looked around the room at faces that were no longer skeptical but moved. These men deserve better. Their families deserve better. And maybe, if we tell the truth about what really happened in Kazakhstan, future operators won't have to worry about being betrayed by the people they trust most. Inspector General Valdez opened the first folder and began reading. After several minutes, she looked up with tears in her eyes. Mr. Chen, on behalf of the United States government, I want to apologize for 8 years of injustice. These men will receive full posthumous honors, and their families will be informed of the true circumstances of their deaths. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. And you, Mr. Chen, will receive the Intelligence Star for your actions in protecting classified materials and ensuring that the truth eventually came to light. Marcus shook his head. I don't need a medal, ma'am. I just needed people to know that Rodriguez, Patterson, and Thompson died as heroes. 3 hours later, Marcus stood on the steps of CIA headquarters with Emma and Sophie, watching the late afternoon sun break through the clouds for the first time all day. News vans were already arriving as word of Harrington's arrest leaked to the media, but Marcus felt strangely calm about the attention to come. Sophie tugged on his sleeve. Dad, is the puzzle solved now? Marcus knelt down to her eye level, the same way he'd done 1,000 times before, but this time without the weight of secrets between them. The puzzle is solved, sweetheart. Good, Sophie said with satisfaction. Now can we plan the wedding? Emma laughed, the sound bright and clear in the crisp air. Yes, we can plan the wedding. Director Cross approached them, having changed from her formal suit into casual clothes that made her look more like a mother than a spy chief. Marcus, there's something I want to ask you. He stood, curious about what else this day could possibly bring. Would you consider staying on as a consultant? Part-time, flexible schedule, nothing that would take you away from Sophie or Emma. But your skills, your experience. She paused. We could use someone who understands that the mission isn't just about protecting the country, it's about protecting the people in it. Marcus looked at Emma, who nodded encouragingly, then at Sophie, who was grinning with excitement at the prospect of her father having a cool secret job she could actually know about. Part-time, he said finally. And only operations that don't require extended travel. Deal, Director Cross replied, extending her hand. As they shook on it, Sophie suddenly wrapped her arms around both of their legs. Are you my grandma now? She asked Director Cross with the devastating directness of childhood. Director Cross looked startled for a moment, then smiled more warmly than Marcus had ever seen. If you want me to be. Good, Sophie declared. Because Emma said we need more family for the wedding pictures. That evening, they had dinner at a small restaurant in Georgetown where nobody talked about classified operations or intelligence failures or government conspiracies. Instead, they talked about normal things, Sophie's upcoming soccer tournament, Emma's research project, Director Cross's attempts to learn how to cook something other than frozen dinners. As they walked back to the car, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. He almost deleted it without reading, but something made him open it. Thank you for giving my dad his honor back. Maria Rodriguez. Marcus showed the message to Emma, who squeezed his hand. It was worth it, she said simply. Yes, Marcus agreed, looking at Sophie skipping ahead of them on the sidewalk, free from the shadows that had haunted her father for 8 years. It was. 6 months later, Marcus Chen married Emma Cross in a small ceremony at a historic inn in Virginia. Sophie served as flower girl, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself and carrying a bouquet of daisies that matched the ones in Emma's hair. Director Cross walked Emma down the aisle, and Agent Martinez served as Marcus's best woman, representing the team that had helped him find his way back to the light. During the reception, an elderly couple approached Marcus with tears in their eyes. David Patterson's parents had flown in from Ohio to meet the man who'd cleared their son's name. They didn't say much, just shook his hand and whispered, "Thank you," before returning to their table. Carlos Rodriguez's widow danced with Marcus during the father-daughter dance portion of the evening, Sophie having insisted that all the honorary family members should participate. As they swayed to the music, she told him about her daughter's graduations, their college plans, their pride in finally knowing the truth about their father's service. He would have liked you, she said simply. You both understood that some things are worth the risk. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus found himself standing on the inn's back porch with Emma, watching Sophie teach Director Cross how to skip stones on the small pond behind the building. "Any regrets?" Emma asked, leaning against his shoulder. Marcus considered the question. 8 years of exile, 3 dead friends, a daughter who'd grown up not knowing who her father really was, and a woman he'd almost lost because he'd been too afraid to trust her with the truth. "Only one," he said finally. Emma looked up at him, concerned. "I wish Rodriguez, Patterson, and Thompson could have been here tonight. They would have loved Sophie." Emma smiled, understanding as always. Maybe they were. Inside the inn, the last of the wedding guests were saying their goodbyes. Tomorrow, Marcus would return to his consulting work with the CIA, helping to ensure that no other operations would be compromised by betrayal from within. Emma would continue her research, with new funding that had mysteriously appeared in her department's budget. Sophie would start 4th grade at a new school closer to their new house, where she could finally talk openly about her father's work when career day came around. But tonight, they were just a family celebrating the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A chapter where secrets didn't define them, where the past informed the present instead of imprisoning it, and where love proved stronger than fear. Marcus Chen, former intelligence analyst, current house painter and CIA consultant, future husband and father, looked out at the Virginia countryside and felt, for the first time in 8 years, like a man who'd finally come home. The truth had set him free. But more importantly, it had set his family free to love him exactly as he was, not despite his secrets, but because of his courage in finally sharing them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.